This is just a spectacular show. I mean, these animals and people just pop up anywhere in the arena. All right, so chapter 15 is kind of wrapping up the life in ancient times, the ancient world. We talked about the Roman gods and Greek gods last week. Real high level kind of stuff. We talked about the primordial gods and the Titans and Olympians and the heroes and all that stuff. So kind of just a high level overview of who the gods were. This mythology that's in first part of chapter 15. We're going to wrap up the second part of chapter 15 was basically life. Okay, so we'll start out with the family. Men had absolute power over the family. Okay, Roman times were male-centered, male-dominated. His word, the man's word of the family, was final. Man, those were the good old days.
You're in trouble now, aren't you?
I'll be sleeping at someone else's house tonight. Among the lower classes of Roman society, the men did all the shopping. We don't want to do that. You and I will be at Walmart. Okay. Women kept a fire tended, fetched water, prepared food, cooked food, and made clothes and shoes. They were more respected in Roman society than they typically were elsewhere. Considered equal to men, were probably treated better during New Testament times than a lot of women are treated today in other countries of the world. Okay. Children. Roman children were subject to whatever their father wanted, okay, including death. The birth of a daughter was not good for the daughter. It's not good for the family, and the father could easily put her to death. Okay, weak, diseased, malformed children, unwanted daughters, they were typically left on a trash heap to die. I'm pretty sorry. In Roman society, 5 neighbors had to agree with this sentence of death, but this agreement was not very difficult to get. Okay, abortion was common in society, and only 1 in 3 of those children not aborted or abandoned lived to 10 years of age or older. Children had a rough time in Roman society. Okay, now these children left on trash heaps, we'll talk about in just a minute, were subject to slavery. So the slave owners, the slave people would go grab these abandoned children, and then those children become slaves for the rest of their lives. And we'll talk about that here shortly. Okay? Jewish children fared much better than their Roman counterparts. Having many children, particularly males, was good. Daughters didn't have to fear their fathers typically. The Jews, of course, were guided by Old Testament principles. Passage after passage. Grandchildren are the crown of the aged. Proverbs 17:6. Saw lots of you bringing in grandchildren today. That's pretty cool. Your children be like olive shoots around your table in Psalms. Sons are indeed a heritage from the Lord. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the sons of one used. Happy is the man who has a quiver full of them. I can actually quote that in the first part of my book, okay, when I talk about the kids and stepkids. Despite their safer stance under Jewish fathers, children were given little thought, and they were basically the least important members of society. Okay, and Jesus kind of turned that on its head, okay, with his teachings. It was very radical for him to teach his way. It was foreign to the apostles' way of thinking. They were entrenched in this Roman society, even this Jewish society, okay, about how children were just nobody. I mean, Jewish children weren't treated horrible, but they were just like nobody, okay, and Jesus completely turned that around. And there's two passages at least illustrate this point. Matthew 18, at that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? He called a child, and he put him among them and said, truly I tell you, unless you change to become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Also in Matthew 19, the little children are being brought to him so he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples spoke sternly to those who brought them, but Jesus said, let the little children come to me, and do not stop them. For it is to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs. Okay? Completely turned thinking of the day on its head. It went in hand with his teachings on who is important in the kingdom of heaven. Remember the parable of the 99 sheep and the lost 1 sheep. Okay? It contradicted the prevailing view of children as the least significant members of society. And a lot of his teachings did that, but children is just one of those. Okay? Slavery. We do not have the time to cover slavery as fully as we could cover it as far as the Bible is concerned, let alone just the society in general. We'll kind of give it a quick overview, kind of like we did the Roman gods and goddesses. Okay? Slavery back then was almost universal. It was rampant throughout Intertestament times and New Testament times, even back to the Old Testament. And we know that because the Mosaic Law talked about slavery a lot. It allowed for slavery. It contained several protections for slaves, and it was one of the mildest forms of slavery in the ancient world under Mosaic law in the Old Testament. This changed with the teachings of Jesus, okay? Within the church, there were no longer slaves or free individuals. Everyone was the same in God's eyes. Romans owned slaves and depended on them more than any other people in recorded history. And this caused some problems for them, part of their downfall of the empire at one time, at the end. Unlike the Greeks, the Romans had little incentive to invent labor-saving machines and devices. Okay, because why? I mean, a slave's gonna do it. If you want to do something that's going to save labor, don't invent it, just call your slave and make them do it. Honest work by free men was looked down upon, since slaves were expected to do all the menial work. Since slaves made many of the items their masters needed, the demand for goods in Rome was small. All right. So where did these slaves come from? Well, the Romans conquered a lot of people. Britain, Gaul, Palestine. I mean, we've covered a lot of these things already, certainly Palestine, the fall of Jerusalem. So these slaves came from these conquered peoples. Within Rome, as I mentioned, often abandoned children were picked up off the trash heaps and turned into slaves. 1/5 to 1/3 of the population of Rome were slaves. It's a lot of slaves. There was a slave market on the island of Delos. It's in the Aegean Sea. You can see I've got a little picture off of Google Maps here. Here's Greece over here, the Turkey basically over there, Asia Minor, and Delos is right here in the middle of the Aegean Sea. Thousands of these slaves were traded every day. Whether they were men, women, or children, they were exhibited naked for sale to the highest bidder. The cost of a slave could vary widely. These aren't my numbers. These aren't my denarii numbers, but these are my calculation in US dollar numbers. So two children and nurse might get 1,800 denarii, about $78,000. Okay, so you had to have some money to be able to buy slaves. A pretty boy might sell for about $108,000. Okay, and like I say, these are just round numbers. A pretty girl might sell for between $87,000 and $261,000, so $250,000. Again, you had to have money to be able to have slaves in the ancient world. Once a person became a slave, it was hard to get out of that, okay? Slave mothers typically begat slave children. Very sad situation back then. The treatment of slaves, they were treated just as horribly after their purchase as they were when they were purchased. Their legal status was the same as a shoe, a pointer, a computer. My property. If a slave ran away from his master, he was committing theft of himself from his master, okay? They could be punished for any offense in any degree, often flogged, tortured, or even crucified. They could be assigned to the mines, which was not a good assignment for them, brutal working conditions, and short life expectancy. In many households, there was a hierarchy of slaves, with master slaves having authority over lower tier slaves. These master slaves were often given the power of punishment over these lower tier slaves, and this punishment might even be more brutal than the master himself might do, okay? And it's no wonder slaves sometimes revolted or simply ran away. We're gonna talk about this in just a minute with Philemon and Onesimus, okay? Just a second, hang on for that. Again, a runaway slave was automatically accused of stealing because he stole himself. Seneca the Younger said that a person had as many enemies as he had slaves. Makes pretty much sense. The rights of slaves, they didn't have very many. They could be executed for whatever. If they're caught trying to pass as a free citizen, execute them. If they were caught trying to serve in the military, execute them. Pretty cut and dry. The brighter side, some slaves managed to rise in the ranks of minor public officials, particularly during the Empire period. The state of Rome employed many of them during the late Republic and Empire periods. At the time of the Empire, there were some laws passed affording some protection for slaves. Under Augustus, it was illegal to send a slave to fight to the death unless he was convicted of a crime. Under Claudius, there were some more laws passed, okay? It was illegal to kill slaves who were sick or unfit for work. And remember Claudius, we talked about this very briefly, he had some physical issues himself as the emperor, you know. He kind of had ticks, or we don't know exactly what kind of diseases or whatever conditions that he had, but it's kind of like the shoe on the other foot with Claudius, okay? You say, well, the slave, he might have a deformity, but that's okay, because I do too. Slaves sometimes did have an allowance called a peculium. It remained the property of the slave owner, but it was available for the slave's use. And this is what the slave was ultimately able to purchase their freedom with, oftentimes. Emancipation of slaves was often done in a temple at Rome, with the god of that temple being as their kind of like their intermediary for the contract. Other times, the slave owner would just go before some witnesses and say, "Yea, verily, I free the slave," and this slave became a free man. Okay, and then ultimately a lot of these freed slaves would then go on to still provide the kind of menial work that they did before, except they weren't slaves. They weren't subject to all these things that slaves are subject to. They would be hired by people, and these people would pay them. By the time this began, it became almost equally popular to hire freemen and free women. More and more slaves began to be freed by the 1st century AD, and again, it's definitely a step up from slavery, but it's a very minority, very low social standing. And that began to take over more of the day-to-day work in Roman households. Some biblical references to slaves. Again, we will not do justice to this. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. Slaves' treatments, right, ownership, property, and servitude. I give several verses there, but let me read one to you. And if a man beats his female or male servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. So there's a protection for a slave, okay? Kind of a minor protection, but a protection nonetheless. Conquered people could become slaves. We read about that in Deuteronomy, Numbers, all the way through the Old Testament. Epistles instruct slaves to obey their masters. Ephesians 6, Paul says, for bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh. Okay? Slavery did not end with the New Testament. Slavery ended with the teachings of Jesus, basically, but it did not end with the New Testament. Slavery serves as a metaphor. In Romans 1, he says, Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ. Okay, so it serves as a metaphor that he was a bondservant, he was a slave to Jesus Christ. Masters would treat slaves fairly. Masters given to your servants that which is just and equal. The entire book of Philemon is about slavery. Okay, Onesimus had escaped, run away, stole himself from Philemon, and Paul wrote a letter to Philemon saying, take him back. Okay, Onesimus and Philemon both were converted by Paul. Okay, when Onesimus showed up at Paul's doorstep, he wrote the letter to Philemon and said, please take him back and treat him no longer as a slave, but as more than a slave, a beloved brother, and to welcome him as you would welcome me. Interesting. Next up, living places. Of course, we talked about a lot of palaces as we've gone along. We talked about Herod the Great, the Hasmoneans, a bunch of them. The palaces over in Caesarea where Pilate and other rulers, prefects, procurators lived. Okay? Very nice palatial mansions that they had. We saw some of these on Masada that Herod built. All the way through Jerusalem, Machaerus, all over the place in Judea that Herod built. So this is the top tier of living places, okay? Then you move, the top tier of living places, by the way, is probably quite a bit less than what we have. I mean, we can go to our homes and have air conditioning and sit in our lazy boys, right? Pretty good. Watch TV. They didn't have any of that back then, but as far as the general population went, they had it pretty good. Next down were townhomes for the rich people. A single family home consists of an atrium surrounded by one or more small rooms. This atrium was an open area where they could have a fire, rainwater would come in, whatever. So an open room surrounded by other rooms, okay, bedrooms and whatnot. Evidence from the 2nd century BC shows that basins were also sometimes used to collect rainwater, and larger homes would sometimes have baths and libraries. So here's a picture of a Roman townhome for a pretty rich person. Okay, you had to be a pretty high up member of society to have a townhome like that. Okay, and that of course is Masada up there, Herod's northern palace to Masada. Next up, apartments. They were called insulae back then, or insula, singular insula, plural insulae. So apartments were insulae, groups of apartment were insulae also. Okay, so an island surrounded by streets was an insulae. Within this insulae were individual insula, or insulae within the insulae. Often 3 or 4 stories high with few windows or no windows. They were either for purchase or rent. Sanitary conditions were quite a range from okay to horrible. Leftovers from meals, trash, sewage, and even broken pots were often simply tossed out the window onto the street. You don't need it, toss it out the window. Yeah, good argument for having a window, I guess, in your apartment, right? Just toss stuff out the window. Juvenal, the Roman poet satirist who lived in the end of the 1st and beginning of the 2nd century AD, he complained about the problem. He said, see what a height it is to that towering roof from which a potsherd comes crack upon my head every time that some broken or leaky vessel is pitched out of the window. See with what a smash it strikes and dents the pavement. There's death in every open window as you pass along at night. You may be well deemed a fool and provident of sudden accident if you go out to dinner without having made your will. You can but hope and put up a piteous prayer in your heart that they may be content to pour down on you the contents of their slump pails. You. That's not the only you thing we'll cover as we go along. So most of these insulae were generally owned by wealthy individuals who often preyed on their tenants. Marcus Licinius Crassus, we talked about him in some detail several weeks ago. He was one of maybe the richest person in Roman society, probably a multi-billionaire by today's standards, but he got it by not so good means, okay? He owned the fire department at Rome, an army of slaves. These insulae were very prone to catching on fire and collapsing. Okay, they would catch on fire, he'd rush up and say, I'll give you $10 for that, and we'll put out the fire. And they say, no. He said, well, all my slaves just kind of kick back and enjoy your weenie roast. And he'd let the place burn down. And they say, okay, we'll sell it for $10 or whatever. I mean, some really lowball sum. They'd sell it for $10, and they would quickly put out the fire, and then he would rebuild it, and then rent it back to them for more money than they were paying before, okay? He became very rich this way. He was maybe the first slumlord of the ancient world, okay? Yeah, not a nice guy. Part 3 of 3, town planning. Rome in some ways was not well planned. In some ways it really was, but throwing your slop out the windows is not a good plan. They didn't really have a way to handle that, okay? A well-planned example is in Caesarea. Herod spent an enormous amount of money on the underlings of Caesarea. He spent a lot of time and effort, Josephus tells us, on building the sewer systems of the city, okay, and the aqueducts that would come along, okay, and feed that city. So a lot of effort was put into the city planning of Caesarea. That's why all these prefects and procurators that were Roman leaders, they would always live in Caesarea. We talked about that, okay? Instead of Jerusalem, a dusty, kind of gross little town compared to Caesarea. Caesarea is very nice by the seaside. Water, many apartments would have running water, paid for by pipe size. Their pipes would be lead, ceramic, wood. Yeah, lead, not so good, I guess. But what you don't know, you don't know. Frequently, water was illegally diverted when you bribed authorities. Water for cities was typically provided by wells, or possible, if not, aqueducts would bring water from great distances. An example is the Pont du Gard here in this picture right here in France, okay? Built in the 1st century AD. Total length is 31 miles, supplied water to a Roman present-day Nimes in France. Aqueducts could not be turned off, okay? So you had to provide for the water going somewhere. So when you built an aqueduct to a city, you had to provide a sewer system for getting rid of the water as it came in if it wasn't used. Furniture in the Roman house, almost non-existent compared to today's standards. You didn't have lazy boys, not many chairs. If you sat around on a couch. If you ate, you usually ate on the couch and reclined on the couch as you ate, okay? You've seen pictures of that probably of people reclining. At the Last Supper, for example, you've seen pictures of the Last Supper where the apostles are leaning over, eating, you know, kind of different than what we do. Well, maybe. Depends on how lazy you are. You kind of lean over, shovel food in your mouth or something while you're watching TV. I don't know, maybe we still do that. Chairs were uncommon. They were reserved for dignitaries like magistrates and judges. And as I mentioned, they reclined. Now, a day and night in the life of a Roman. Lighting was expensive, okay? Those of you who came in late, I have an oil lamp over there from the 1st century, about 2,000 years old, they tell me. As someone mentioned, it doesn't have a wick, it doesn't have the olive oil, but it's the ancient oil lamp over there that you can take a look at. It was very expensive. It was also food. If I have a choice between light and food, what am I going to take? Food. So lighting was very expensive, particularly if you're poor. So what they did was they got up at dawn, went to bed at dark. You would probably like that. I'm a little more of a night owl than she is, okay? But up at dawn, bed at night, because you didn't want to pay for light. All right, you didn't want to pay for oil. A pint of oil, olive oil, lasted about 40 to 50 hours. Candles were made from tallow, which is the fat of sheep, cattle, vegetable matter, whatever. Tallow was also expensive and also edible. So again, food or light, food often won out if you were a poor person. And this kind of gives more meaning to what Jesus said. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. That's kind of cool. Next up, public restrooms. Everybody's favorite subject, right? Shelley said she wasn't coming to class today because of this subject, but we're going to talk about it anyway. And y'all are going to love it, I hope. All right. They were often associated with public baths. Seats were made of wood or stone and lined up side by side without dividing partitions. Now, I had a picture, I looked this morning, because we were talking about if we had a picture of us together, and we don't. I only have a picture of myself on there. but it was a little bit embarrassing, so I didn't put that in there. So this is a toilet in Bet Shan that we went to in Israel. You can see the stone seats line up side by side, so you go plop one cheek on each stone, and you'd be sitting by your neighbor. Okay, yeah, Shelley says she'd probably never go to the bathroom, I guess. Two separate areas below the seats. The row in back, there's water that was flowing that would carry off the solid matter. Oh, people are shaking their heads. The row in front was more clean water that you would clean yourself with. Cleaner's kind of it's all in the eye of the beholder, I guess. Okay, so my question is, what am I holding in my hand? It's a paint sponge. But it's also could be considered a very probably high quality tertiarium. Romans would share something.
Ew.
Like a corn cob.
Yeah, well, a corn cob would be clean. A shared sponge on a stick. After defecating, which would be rinsed in either the running water or a bucket of salt water vinegar and set out for the next person to use. Oh, I see the women's stomachs turning now. The men are saying, that's pretty cool. Yeah, give me a stick with a sponge. I'm a man. Yeah, not so much. And there's actually a picture of one. I don't know if they actually found that in ancient digs or whatever, but there's a more accurate than my paintbrush up here. So anyway, that was an interesting little find over in Bet Shan, Israel. As you go, you'll see these kind of restrooms, public restrooms.
Did you actually use that restroom?
Did not actually use it, but I sat there. It's a little bit too open for me, I think.
Yeah, it's big, like a room size big.
Yeah, it's big, and there's people milling all around, so that's not a restroom you really use. Not today. I got other pictures of it too that show kind of the full overall view of what this thing looks like. Public baths. This is a picture that I didn't take this, but I've been to Bath, England. This is a picture of the Bath in Bath, England, which is kind of a neat place to go. But Romans during their spare time would do a lot of drinking and dining and talking and bathing and playing games at the bath, okay? It was a social meeting place of their day. Instead of going on sitting in somebody's porch, they would meet at the bath. Hey, meet us at the bath at noon, we'll bathe, or whatever. They were often built and paid for from the public treasury by the emperor. Sometimes they were enormous. The baths of Caracalla cover some 270,000 square feet. That is a big chunk of water. Now, a lot of these had other things, libraries and places for the kids to play or whatever, okay? So these baths could be very big. Diocletian's baths were larger and could accommodate over 3,000 bathers. Chlorine was invented in 1774. Just saying. Smaller baths were run privately. A small entrance fee, usually a quadrans, about 75 cents was required, and typically wealthy people who were running for office would come along and say, I'll give you your quadrans, you go take a bath on me, okay? Don't forget that I did that for you. You might want to vote for me for consul later on or something, okay? So that's what wealthy politicians would do. Politicians today actually use other people's money, whereas back then they used their own money. That's kind of a difference. We're going to show several differences between things today and things back then. First, they were open only to men, but then open to men, women, and children by the end of the time of the Roman Empire. There were often separate rooms for the sexes, but mixed bathing was relatively common, particularly starting during the time of Nero. Larger baths often contained gardens, promenades, gyms, swimming pools, and even libraries. There were baths within baths, and you'll see this as you travel through Jerusalem. We saw it in Masada. It seemed like we saw it at Bet Shan also, where the bathroom was. But we see the floors, where the floor is gone, but you see pillars in the floor, and they would put hot air under these floors, okay, and that would heat the bath up. All right. So hot air pumped underneath the walls, bright heated areas. A calidarium was when a heated room was combined with a hot water plunge bath, very warm area. A laconium or sudatorium was a bathless room that was hotter than the calidarium for dry sweating, and the slaves would often go in and scrape sweat off people as they went into this sudatorium. A tepidarium was a warm room, typically without a bath. A frigidarium was a cold room with a cold plunge bath. You would not be frequently one of those. Romans would often progress from one area to another in these complexes. Now, you do that today. We went to somewhere in Oregon, I don't remember what, we went to a hot spring, okay? And we got in the very top part of the basic, cascaded down to several different pools. So we got in the very top one. It was just scalding hot. At least I thought so. I think he felt it great. It was too hot for me.
No, that was too hot to be in.
That was too hot for you even, so that was hot. So then we went to a middle pool and it was pretty warm for me too, okay? And then we went to the final pool and it had cooled off pretty good bit by then. So you can kind of go experience that same kind of thing today with this progression of rooms that the Romans did.
Hot Springs, Arkansas is like that too.
Oh, okay, I've not been there, so
Yeah, you cannot.
vacation I did, so.
They have to cool the water coming out of the mountain before they can use it.
Yeah. Anyway, chlorine 1774. Gladiatorial games, part one. The earliest games were around 264 BC. The earliest amphitheaters about 120 BC. The Flaming Amphitheater, the Colosseum in Rome, built by Vespasian, and then finished by his son Titus in AD 70. And the Jews basically paid for that with the spoils from the temple. It is 617 by 510 feet, about 6 acres, could hold 45,000 people. That's a pretty good sized facility. A large hypogeum, an underground area under the Colosseum, was used for containing gladiators and animals and lifts and elevators and all kinds of cool stuff. I watched a video on the Colosseum yesterday. We don't have time to cover all the detail, but go check out some of the YouTube videos on that. It's very interesting. And it's interesting, I was watching this video and I saw a video advertised over here that popped up and said, Roman money, or said, somebody has got a video on Roman money, I ought to go check that out. And I hadn't seen the thumbnail yet because Kenny had just posted it. And I looked over there and it was actually me. So I did something on Roman money, yeah, okay. So anyway, there were, underneath the ground, there were gladiators, cages for animals, vertical shafts for bringing animals up. It was just a spectacular show. I mean, these animals and people just pop up anywhere in the arena, okay? Very, very interesting the way they did some of this stuff. Go check that out. We don't have time to cover that. Who are the gladiators? They were often criminals condemned to death, prisoners of war, other non-Roman citizens. There were some volunteers or some women and dwarfs. Gladiators who performed well would often receive bags of gold and laurel crowns, okay? You could go on to become gladiator trainers or bodyguards for the rich and famous. So there was an upside to being a gladiator. So a nobody could become a somebody, but the odds were not in their favor. The best gladiators became heroes. They were sought after by women. So a lot of people went and did the gladiator thing, okay? If they survived, it was good for them. If they didn't survive, not so much, okay? Training schools, the most famous, the Lotus Magnus, located next to the Colosseum. All of these during the Empire period came under the auspices of the Roman Emperor. Because if you think about it, remember Spartacus? He led the slave revolt. We talked about him one week, a couple of months ago, whatever. So he led the slave revolt against Rome. The Empire did not like that very much. So all these training schools come under their control, okay? So they could keep the gladiators under control. All right. Now, training a gladiator was a significant investment. Every time one was killed, you lose that investment, okay? Kind of a bummer for the guys who own them, I guess. Part two, by the 4th century AD, some extravagant show was put on for almost half of the days in a year. This is a lot of killing, a lot of death, a lot of blood that was going on for a lot of the year, okay? They were often funded by private individuals who were very wealthy. The game would often start with the sponsor leading a grand procession of the combatants and the animals through the city to the Colosseum, and it was free for the people to attend. They would use ostriches and giraffes who might be killed by bands of archers. They would use elephants. They'd fit the elephants with long tusks, long spikes on their tusks, and the elephants would go and gore each other before one of them was killed, okay? The winning elephant might be allowed to crush a criminal's skull as his reward for being the winning elephant, okay? Then archers would sometimes shoot the elephant and kill the final elephant, okay? Just a brutally bloody, awful thing that they did. Okay. Increasingly exotic animals were brought in from all over the world, all over the known world at the time, for these games. Okay. People say, wow, that's a giraffe. I've never seen a giraffe before. There's a zebra. I hadn't seen a zebra. That's pretty cool. So this really brought in the people. Bread in circuses, right? That's the same. Bread in circuses. That was the emperor's way of keeping control of people. Have these games, have this entertainment, have your phone. Keep the people entertained, and they won't revolt, okay? But they didn't have social media back then, so the kind of revolt thing is not working out so good for us, okay? There were variously armed gladiators. One team might be heavily armed, like the provocateur, this guy right here, provocateur. He had a breastplate, a helmet, a shield. He had protection on his arm. He had greaves. Others were not very highly armed, like a Gladiator. Okay, he basically had a trident and a net. Okay. Now, you would think the heavily armed guy would always win, but this guy, he'd move around. He'd go around behind the Procurator, stab him in the back, maybe, because the Procurator's got all his armor he's trying to maneuver around with. So they tried to match people pretty evenly, even though they were matched very differently. Different, but even. Okay. You can see all these pictures in the book. You can see a description of all these positions and some more. In the book also, if you're interested in all the details of what kind of equipment they had and that kind of thing. A typical gladiatorial game, criminals, and this is typical. I mean, there's other stuff that went on in the morning too, okay? But typically, prisoners of war were executed at lunchtime. An example might be hundreds of Jews pushed into the center of the arena, and then they would release lions and tigers, and they would go kill all the Jews in the center of the arena, okay? Some early Christians may have met a similar fate because they illegally met. They did not worship the Roman gods. They did not worship the Roman emperor. So they may have met similar fate, but we don't have any evidence of them meeting this fate in the Colosseum. Okay, they probably did, but we don't have evidence of that I know of. Gladiatorial games would begin in the afternoon, could start with 2 teams of 24 gladiators each. Once only a few remained, 2 of them on horseback would then fight it out. When one of these was struck down, the crowd would decide his fate. The emperor would decide his fate. Now, usually in the movie, you will see, let him live, let him die. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. We know there was a hand signal of some kind. We don't know what the hand signal was. Most, if you go look at the AIs, okay, you see different. Up, they think meant killing. It's kind of doesn't make sense. And a closed thumb like this meant to save him. We don't know any of that for sure, but that's kind of the feeling of what the hand signals were. We do know, again, there were hand signals used by the emperor, and the emperor would look to the crowd, did he fight good? Yeah, save him, so, okay. Did he fight bad? No, he's a coward, kill him, so. And they killed him. Okay. Each match would have come down to only 1 or 2 survivors. Now, the death sentence was not as common as we might think of it as in the movies, because remember, gladiators were expensive pieces of property, okay? It took a lot of money and time and effort to train a gladiator. If you go and kill one, then you've lost that investment, okay? So if you're not too badly wounded, you probably would survive to fight again, okay? If, however, you were significantly wounded, not so good for you. Slaves used ropes and metal hooks to remove the dead and severely wounded, who they usually killed. Seems like kind of a not good way to get dragged out of the arena. Other slaves would spread new sand on the floor. And in fact, the word arena, from which our word arena comes from, means sand. That's where that word comes from. The bodies were placed on carts and carried out to a masquerade. The cleanup would be in preparation for the next event, multiple each day for sometimes weeks on end. This continued year after year after year for almost 700 years. That's a lot of death. That's a lot of blood. That's a lot of destruction. Finally stopped by the 5th century AD. There's evidence that combat with wild animals continued until the 6th century AD. Other entertainment, this will be more my thing, chariot racing, kind of cool. Dated back to the Roman monarchy. The largest venue for chariot racing was the huge Circus Maximus in Rome. Could seat about 150,000 spectators. That's a whole lot of people. So there is some writing in the literature that could hold as much as 250,000 people. This is probably not correct by Pliny the Elder. Similar to what our stadiums hold today, the largest, the Strahov Stadium in Prague, with a capacity of about 220,000 people. The largest sports facility in the world is the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. I did not know this, so I was researching the book. With seating capacity of 235,000 people, infield seating capacity of 165,000 people. That's a lot of people. The Circus Maximus, including seating, measured 2,000 by 449 feet. Spectators at the circus would bet on the outcome of the races, just like not we, but a lot of people do on horse races today, or football games, or whatever. Okay, they bet on this, like we do today. People would arrive before dawn to attend. Slaves were typically excluded. Each chariot race, known as a heat, consisted of 12 teams of 4 horses each, and each heat involved about 6 miles, okay? So it's kind of an exciting time, and there are typically 10 to 12 heats a day, bred and circuses. There seems to be a lack of interest in general among Romans in the performing arts. Now we're kind of performing arts people. We go to a lot of plays and concerts and things like that. So there were a few back in the time. They were performed in theaters, which were fundamentally amphitheaters, like the Colosseum, cut in half, okay? The first permanent theater was built in 55 BC by Pompey. Unlike their Greek counterparts, Roman theaters had a back to them, so you wouldn't be able to see through them like the other ones. Law and justice. Although law in the United States is based on English common law, some parts of the law from what the Romans originally created. The Roman law arguably started with the law of the 12 tables, which was basically passed to tell you how these different classes of people should interact with each other. It was put in written form about 449 BC. We have fragments of that. And then Roman law evolved over a period of 1,000 years, culminating in 529 with the Corpus Julius Civilis by the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian I. Differences in Roman law and modern law. The Romans did not provide public prosecutors as we do today. If you were to bring charges against someone, you had to do that yourself. This explains why the Sanhedrin were coming up with charges on their own with Jesus to go to Pilate. Okay? Pilate was not a prosecutor. There was no such thing as a prosecutor in the Roman government. People brought charges themselves. If you killed a relative of mine, then I would bring charges against you. The state did not do that. Okay? Frivolous lawsuits were treated very harshly, which I kind of wish we do that today. We don't. They believe that only the wealthy could afford to be honest. That's kind of a different thing for us today. This likely came from the Roman upper class because they were the ones writing the law. Kind of different. We think that power corrupts. They thought that power does not corrupt. You couldn't trust someone who was poor, but you could trust someone who was wealthy. Jesus turned this on his head. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." That's kind of cool. Again, Jesus turned a lot of things on their head. How to get citizenship, Roman citizen. It's a highly coveted status. You had to be a freeborn person. The Roman emperor could bestow it. It could also be purchased. A Roman citizen could only be bound or flogged. Okay, and we see some of this, an example of this in Acts 22, when Paul was about to be flogged by a military tribune. And when the tribune found out, he said, "Oh, whoa, I didn't mean to do that. Let's unbind you. I didn't know you're a Roman citizen. I'm so sorry. I can't do that. I'm not allowed to do that." Okay. They also afforded protection for prisoners and other Roman citizens. Okay. We see examples of this when Paul was escorted to Antipatris and then to Caesarea. They had a right to appeal to the Roman emperor, which Paul did when he was tried before Porcius Festus. He knew if he was taken back to Jerusalem, he would have been killed, so he appealed to Caesar to keep that from happening. And again, he was taken by Roman guards, Roman soldiers to Rome. Exile, punishment. It's kind of like the low end of punishment, used mostly for the upper class. It could be either permanent or temporary. We've seen some examples of this already. We saw that it happened to Herod Antipas and Herodias when they were exiled by Caligula. Sometimes an arrest would be delayed so a person could go into voluntary exile. That's kind of a cool way of doing things, right? That's kind of like what some of these other countries did to us when they emptied their prisons and sent everybody to the U.S., all their criminals to the U.S., okay? That's kind of a voluntary-ish exile. It becomes somebody else's problem, If we don't like somebody, we'll say, "We're going to arrest you tomorrow at noon, unless you happen to get out of town," and well, what can we do? So kind of like voluntary exile. All right. Torture was used to extract information from a person, probably most likely a slave or a lower class, because they couldn't be trusted. So you end up torturing them first. Many examples of torture in the reign of Caligula. Remember Chariot? He tortured this beautiful actress and maimed her, disfigured her. That's a story we covered several weeks ago. Eventually began to be used in civil as well as criminal proceedings. Incarceration was not as frequent as it is today, typically for those awaiting trial, as opposed to a form of punishment. Several examples in Acts. Mostly incarceration was for debtors' prison, and jailers back then would often be killed if their prisoners escaped. We see that Herod Agrippa killed the guards who let Peter escape. We saw the jailer responsible for Paul and Silas almost killed himself after an earthquake, and and Paul said, "Wait, we're here. Don't kill yourself. You're good. Everything's good." So he didn't kill himself. Flogging was for questioning, obtaining confession and punishment. Sometimes the scriptures refers to someone being examined by flogging. I've always kind of wondered what that meant, but it was an examination to get information. You get one strike, give me information. Well, that's not the information I want. You get another strike, and finally, people would just give up information even if they had to make something up. Often used as punishment. We see many examples throughout the New Testament. Who was doing the flogging? Jewish law allowed 39 stripes, 40 stripes actually, but they would typically do 39 to make sure they didn't go over 40. Roman law, no such thing. When Jesus was flogged, he could have been flogged way more than 40. We don't know. When Paul was flogged by Jews, 39 stripes. When Paul was flogged by Romans, we don't know. More than 40, probably. There are other punishment: fines, hard labor, forced enrollment, gladiator training schools, decapitation if you're military personnel, burning alive, drowning, being fed to wild animals. Lots of those were not good ways to go. So crucifixion was the ultimate punishment by Rome. Okay, that was for the worst of the worst. Okay, and Pilate didn't think Jesus was the worst of the worst, but he was convinced to condemn Jesus to death by crucifixion. Okay, so it was used as a deterrent. Crosses were often placed on busy roads, on top of hills, outside the cities where people could see them. Okay, the victims were usually left on the cross for days or weeks after they died, a constant reminder to not do things against Rome. Okay, and the victims would be eaten by animals, birds, and that kind of thing. Humiliation. They were often crucified naked. We see all four Gospels referring to the Romans gambling over Jesus' garments. Okay. Some suffered additional pain and humiliation of having a stick forced upward through their groin. Okay, humiliating and very painful. Immediately Matthew 27:48, immediately one of them ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour round, and put it on a reed and offered it to him to drink. Now, thank you, Grayson. Last week he pointed out something interesting that, we don't know, but it is interesting to think about that we talked about last week, this sponge on a stick, okay, a tersorium, okay. It is a sponge on a stick like they offered to him. The whole goal of crucifixion was not just to kill the person, but to humiliate them, okay? Total humiliation, total degradation, and total misery and death, okay? If you take a stick with a sponge and fill it with vinegar, it could have been a tersorium that we talked about last week. Again, part of the humiliation. Now, I went and started looking at some of the Greek words for this, okay? So tersorium is a Latin word. The Greek word for that is xylopongium. Xylon means stick. Spongos means sponge, okay? Sponge on a stick, all right? Xylopongium. So Perplexity, one of the AIs that I use, says they are basically equivalent, okay? Tersorium in Latin is exactly equivalent to xylopongium in Greek, okay? So sponge on a stick that they offered to Jesus may have been a tersorium, like we talked about last week, another level of humiliation. The parts of the cross. So thank you for kind of pointing in that direction. Also, I never cease to be amazed at the level of wisdom in this room. You did such an amazing talk 2 or 3 weeks ago on Barabbas, the prisoner that was released, about how he was probably a criminal, maybe a zealot or something. And I was thinking about that. Maybe the two guys crucified on each side of Jesus were part of that gang. You know, they were called thieves, but that's not enough in our vernacular today to really talk about the level of crime that they had committed. They did more than thievery. They were really probably rebellers against Rome, okay? Possibly along with Barabbas. That was a really good talk. Again, I've never ceased to be amazed by the level of wisdom in this room. Thank you all for pointing stuff out like that to me. So the parts of the cross, crosses typically were not much taller than the victim. Their feet were only a few inches from the ground typically. There are several different parts of the cross. The patibulum was the crossbeam, was what likely Jesus bore to the cross, to the burial place or the crucifixion place. The saticulum was a standing part of the cross in the ground. It was permanently in the ground. The crossbeam was unattached after the victim had been tied or nailed to it. Okay. Now, we don't know 100% if all this is true, but pretty good idea that probably it is true. There were some additions provided sometimes to increase the amount of time for the victim to stay alive and to have more humiliation. Okay. Sometimes they would add a supinatum, a footrest attached to the bottom of the cross. Now, when you're hanging on the cross, and we'll talk about in just a minute, next slide, I think it is, the problem with people dying is asphyxiation. Most people believe, because as you slump down, you can't breathe anymore. So this supinatum, when they put on the cross, a person could actually push up enough with their feet to breathe. Okay, so that was a means to keep people alive longer on the cross. Why? Because they're just mean. I mean, they're just horribly mean. Okay, they wanted to keep them alive as long as possible. Another thing they may have added was the seat aisle, a small seat about halfway down on the staticulum, often pointed to enhance the victim's pain. But again, the victim could kind of sit down on that and take enough weight off his arms in order to be able to breathe. Again, in order to prolong the punishment, prolong the pain. Okay. No evidence either way if these were on the cross of Jesus. The shape of the cross varied considerably during Roman times. Typically, they were X, Y, or T shaped, either a lowercase t or an uppercase T. The Romans crucified those escaping from Jerusalem during the siege of AD 70 in many different configurations. Josephus tells us about all kinds of configurations they used. The Romans may have tied the hands or arms to the cross in addition to being nailed. Okay, and we've probably heard that before. Part 2, Causes of death. Some say heart failure, arrhythmia, whatever, serious blood loss. Could be any of these, all of these. Increase in the acidity of the blood, the lack of oxygen, blockage of one of the arteries of the heart or lungs, severe infection. You know, they say if you survive long enough, you might have severe dehydration or infection. You might be eaten by wild animals. Suffocation or asphyxiation, generally believed to be probably the primary cause of death on the cross. Often the legs will be broken. They did that to the criminals on each side of Jesus. They broke their legs. They were still alive. They came to Jesus. He was dead. They did not break his legs. Fulfill prophecy, right? Okay, but they did break the legs of the two guys beside him in order so they couldn't push up anymore to get any breath. So you just die. You die from asphyxiation. Other means of hastening death included stabbing, pummeling, or starting a fire at the foot of the cross. Josephus tells us one case where someone survived crucifixion. During the siege of Jerusalem, Josephus saw many captives crucified and remembered 3 of them as my former acquaintances, and went with tears in my eyes to Titus and told him of them. So he immediately commanded them to be taken down. Yet 2 of them died under the physician's hand, while the 3rd recovered. So you can recover from crucifixion, which is pretty rare. Crucifixion were used all throughout the Intertestament and New Testament periods, all the way back to the Persians that we know, the Seleucids, Carthaginians, Romans. Alexander Janus, we talk about this, crucified 800 Pharisees and slit his wives and kids' throats while he was crucifying. I have a question, though. I need someone to look this up. So we read about in Psalms 22:16 that talks about the pierced hands and feet. So Psalms was written during the time of the United Kingdom of Israel. Okay, I don't know if crucifixion went back that far. Maybe it did. This is something that ought to be researched, I think. I think it's interesting that if crucifixion only went back to, say, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, okay, in this period of history, and he's talking about pierced hands and feet back in this period of history, wow, that's a pretty amazing prophecy in and of itself, right? They're just talking about pierced hands and feet, maybe before crucifixion was even a thing. I don't know the answer to that, but something interesting to, y'all research that and let me know next week. The Roman Emperor Constantine I, being a Christian, abolished crucifixion in AD 337 out of veneration for the crucified Jesus. All right, part 3. I'm not going to talk about this much because we've already talked about it, I think, a couple of times. But when I wrote the book, the section on crucifixion, probably about 2016-17 time frame, there was at the time only one instance in the literature of a bone fragment they found from a crucified man. Yohanan, they found it in Jerusalem, son of Hezekiah. Okay, he was executed sometime between 180 BC and AD 70, between 24 and 28 years old when he died, and we talked about the bone fragments that they found. And there's a picture of a replica of the bone fragments. They actually, when Jews find stuff, they actually bury the fragments. If they find a piece of somebody, they will actually bury that, but they have a replica in the Israel Museum. And we talked about how there was an article at first, it looked like he was crucified with his feet crossed over with one nail, but then it looked like, after they did more analysis, that he was crucified on each side of the cross with a nail on each side. All right, the Roman military. That's enough about crucifixion. The legion was the main body of the Roman military. It varied considerably throughout Roman history. During the monarchy, back in the 7 kings of the monarchy, early on, they probably just had one legion, about 4,000 infantry, 600 cavalry. Perhaps ranged from 3,000 to 6,000 people over time. And if you included all the people that supported it, could be many thousands of people. The next smallest unit in the legion was called the Maniples, up until the Marius reforms of BC 107 108. Okay, the Maniples was then renamed a cohort, and I'm going to show you that figure of that here in just a minute. Okay, Maniples and cohorts were divided into centuries of 50 to 160 men each, depending on the period. Soldiers could be Roman citizens or allies of Rome. The Roman citizens decided what to pay the Roman soldiers. Okay, wasn't much. Denarius a day, typically. But you want to become a Roman soldier because you could share in the bounty. You got a good general like Julius Caesar or Octavian or somebody like that. You know, they're going to be conquering all kinds of people, and you're going to be sharing in the booty. You're going to be conquering the city, and all of a sudden you're going to get some gold pieces because of your work. Okay? So it was worth it for a person to be a Roman soldier back then. Okay? But because of this bounty sharing that the generals did, this caused soldiers to become more loyal to the generals. And we talked about this a couple of weeks ago or sometime. And that's why Julius Caesar was so powerful. That's why he could cross the river and come and attack Rome and cause a civil war of Rome. That's why Octavian was so powerful, because he had the legions, okay? That's why Vespasian was so powerful. He brought his legions with his son's legions, okay? And they were able to take over Rome, and he could become emperor because of this loyalty of the soldiers to the emperor instead of to the Senate, okay? Kind of interesting. And again, we talked about that. All right, The Roman military before the Marius reforms of 108 BC, they had 3 lines of infantry. The hastati line in front. This is the front, the area fighting here. So the hastati, the princeps, and the trari. And some literature says there's a 4th line called the rorori, who are the oldest citizens. That would be me. I would be the rorori line. I'd be standing back there with my sword, fighting, and all you young guys will be up here either in the hastati or the princeps line. Okay, so the 2 lines, the hastati and the princeps line, were composed of this. Okay, it was composed of the cavalry of 80 men in a century, and then velites of about 20 men. Or I'm sorry, 60 and 20. So about 80 men per century, 2 centuries per maniple, 10 maniples per line. Okay, so 10, 20, 30 maniples total for a Roman legion. 1,200 velites were the lower class. They really didn't have any weapons or anything, or they had weapons but no armor, so, probably didn't end up well for them. Again, as I mentioned, it's composed of 30 maniples with 60 centuries per legion, and was commanded either by a consul, praetor, or dictator. So that's what the Roman legion looked like prior to 108 BC. When Marius came along, Gaius Marius, and he became Roman consul in 108 BC, he decided to reform the military because he found he could not get enough soldiers for what he wanted to do. He couldn't raise an army because there were some strict requirements of being a soldier. You had to have some wealth. You had to have some land. You had to be able to supply your own arms. Some people just couldn't do those things. Okay, so he reformed that. So he dropped the wealth requirement. He had the Roman state pick up the expense of arming the soldiers. He implemented a standing army with year-round training and restructured the legion to have 4,800 combatants with about 1,200 support personnel, so 6,000 people. Organized each legion into 10 cohorts. Now we go from the maniple to the cohort of 400 men each instead of 30 maniples of either 100 or 160 men each. So you see the simplicity that he implemented for the military at this point. We had these different lines before. We had these different sizes of maniples and stuff, and thus the centuries. Okay, so it really was a simplification of the Roman military that Marius did. All right, and that, my friends, is chapter 15.